Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 23 cheat sheet. We'll be looking at, of course, once again, the doubt over Haaland and whether he'll start this weekend. So last week we did say that it was very much expected based on how, let's say, City have treated, for example, the KDB injury previously, that Haaland would come off the bench, and that he did. So my concern, I suppose, this week is outside of, let's say, the tactical setup versus Brentford, could it actually be the case where we just see Haaland continue to get managed in terms of his fitness and that actually he might be on the bench again? And that's probably one of the things that we have to consider. At the same time, I would say that for those managers who don't really have much choice in terms of, let's say, price points within the game, if you let's say have 0.0 in the bank, I do think this is the week to sort of execute that move if you have to. Otherwise, I do think this is a week where maybe you can actually reassess, have a look at some of your other injured players, have a look at, for example, your defense this week, see if you want to rectify it. In terms of the midfield, though, starting from there, we don't have too many changes in the budget midfield position. I think simply the position is quite locked and quite stable. You have players like Douglas Luiz, who, of course, we know are not amazing in open play, but can just deliver a lot through FPL through set pieces and, of course, the key one, which is penalty taking. As far as Garnacho, his minutes continue to be really good with United, so no complaints really about his position in the cheat sheet. Palmer, for me, is still the king of all the budget players by far, and that's even, considering the fact that he's going to have a blank game week in game week 26. So for me, I just think when you look at Palmer being a penalty taker for Chelsea and still getting good minutes, of course, he did get subbed off earlier in the Liverpool game, but I would very much say it's reminiscent of when, let's say, Solanke got subbed off early himself versus Liverpool, just because you don't really see yourself getting back into the game with the team, and it does make sense to take a player like Palmer off. As far as the sort of changes here, we do have Ben Brereton Diaz, who actually does get a rise. What I wanted to see, of course, is, we do have enough information of Ben Brereton Diaz in terms of actually playing competitive football and seeing his underlying stats in previous seasons. But the key thing, of course, is, the Premier League is still a step up, even from, for example, his sort of limited outgoings within Villarreal. And I do think that with the minutes and how he's playing so well, that you can be safe about the minutes for him, and still, with his sort of ceilings as a player, I do think he's still worth sort of considering as a budget pick. Does it make sense to really go for him over someone like Garnacho? I'm not necessarily sure. 2 goals is still, of course, something that we would say is an over performance for now, but it's early days for him too. So I think it's just a question of whether you're confident the Sheffield United team can sort of also provide with enough chances for him to thrive as well, which would be the problem. As far as the sort of next tier, I do actually have Gross getting a rise again. And the reason why a lot of people might be questioning this is because, of course, Gross has been pretty dismaying the last 2 weeks. But the key change that I see is that the João Pedro injury, if it is bad, if it is significant, is going to be a huge boost to Gross, right? We all tend to sort of ignore penalty takers until they score penalty takers. And the reality, of course, is Gross is someone who will be and should be on penalties now for this Brighton team. So irrespective of the fact that maybe he's not been actually getting goals and assists within the last few weeks, his underlying stats for the course of this season have been very positive. And now that he's going to be on penalties for the short term, I think he's a very, very strong pick still. So I wouldn't be actually even considering, for example, selling Gross if I was a Gross owner. Instead, I would actually be considering, for example, thinking about whether you want to choose between a transfer in like Gordon or Gross. Richarlison for me is still top tier, but of course the issue I suppose with Richarlison is that simply you're looking at a player who will probably lose a little bit of minutes because Werner is playing very well himself and Son will come back at some point in time. South Korea, of course, were able to continue within the Asian Cup competition, so it doesn't really hurt Richarlison for the immediate future. But keep in mind, of course, that there's going to be a blank game week in game week 26. If you try to sell him, I think you would sell him then. I would not be selling beforehand because, of course, even for example, his centre forward replacement in, Belize is also set to be on loan. So that's the sort of position. Right now, I'd probably prioritize on going for Gordon just because the next 3 fixtures are amazing. And also the key shift here with Gordon is that Isaac is injured. So we're probably going to see Gordon centre forward. And you never know. He really could be the penalty taker for this team, although I think it's likely going to be Trippier because there were times, I remember at least watching Newcastle games where Trippier was set to take the penalty, or at least sort of faked the idea that he would. And that's pretty much it. With Eze and Olise, we have updates from Roy Hodgson. Apparently, Eze has to have a scan. So that's very dismaying news for people like myself who transferred in Eze last week. So we now have potentially an injured player for this Brighton game, and then the next game will be Chelsea. Now, Chelsea away from home isn't exactly a great team from the defensive point of view. So actually, when I think about Eze, and his utility in Game Week 24, that's very good still. With Brighton, of course, you probably would have liked to have him play this game just because if you have Liverpool and Arsenal players in your team, this is a week where you still might want to play players from other teams who actually have still easier opponents. And I think Brighton away would still be an easy one from Eze's point of view. As far as Elise, though, the news is really positive, and I think that maybe pushes him a little bit ahead of Elise, or pushes him a little bit ahead of Eze for the time being. Another rise has been also given to Ward-Prowse. I think part of the reason why I'm comfortable giving him the rise now is because as the sort of out and out penalty taker with most of the players sort of coming back, I don't really think that there's anything wrong with continuing to own penalty takers within our teams. We have someone like Douglas Luiz who has very similar underlying stats to someone like James Ward-Prowse. I sort of look at James Ward-Prowse as a slightly more expensive version of Douglas Luiz, and that's sort of what you're looking at within a player here. As far as Kudus, I think the issue, of course, is still the underlying stats so far this season have been very, very poor, but the sample size at the same time has been very, very shallow. So we also need to sort of consider whether we think he's a career overperformer, and he very well could be, but I think also we don't need to necessarily jump the gun on him. Of course, with West Ham, as I said, it's hard to, for example, pick, let's say, the second or third best attacking player within that team, particularly when I don't even think on an overall level that they've been that amazing. So that's why you're seeing, for example, me sort of downscaling Bowen a little bit, who I think is now, for example, contextually overpriced within the field. And you can see that, of course, with the changes where Maddison, of course, comes back into play. I think more so, really, Maddison deserves to be probably a green pick if he wasn't going to have a blank game week in Game Week 26. So from that context, I think that Maddison is probably the player who I'd like to transfer in later down the line. The same thing with, for example, thinking about leaving room for Son. But Richarlison, for example, is a bit different in that I know a lot of the field already own Richarlison. Plus, of course, he's at a price point where you're not stretching that much for a player who could cause team structure issues as you try to make transfers to alleviate how bad or how strong your team might be for Game Week 26. In terms of Kulusevski, he gets a full. I just think that ultimately he's a player who plays enough minutes for this Tottenham team, but as you can see, like a Martinez or like a Kudus, still has really, really poor underlying stats compared to a lot of his peers within these price points and these categories, and in general within the midfield position. So for me, I'm not very comfortable with Kulusevski, given that he doesn't have any sort of extra additional access to points like set pieces. For example, your open play stats usually correlate quite well to your expected goal involvement, although that doesn't really take into account whether you're a penalty taker. If you're a penalty taker, of course, your XG will be steroided. Whereas, for example, with someone like Kulusevski, that's pretty much all he's relying on. And then as far as someone like, let's say, Ward-Prowse or even someone like maybe Douglas Luiz, when you're taking set pieces as well, the expected assists aren't particularly high for set pieces. But for example, if someone scores a header, that could be a very low XG chance, but you're actually getting very consistent sort of chances, I suppose, at getting those assists. So it usually doesn't correlate perfectly, but it actually works out very well when you're a set piece taker. And it also allows you, of course, to sort of get bonus points as well, which is something that I think we sort of don't think about too often. As far as the sort of upgraded positions and the premium positions, I have to drop Odegaard, and I've even taken Rashford out. I just think that Rashford's minutes still are too poor to really be considered. Fernandes still feels like a differential just because, as you can see, the underlying stats for him this season have massively dropped off, and the same, of course, has happened with Odegaard. Personally, I think, as I said, Saka always is the Arsenal asset that I'm still most into, and that's because, of course, a significant amount of pen share that we attribute towards him, and also just an increase in underlying stats. So despite, for example, this Arsenal team actually getting worse from a team attack point of view year on year, I suppose, you could see actually that the counter to that has happened with Saka, right, where he's actually become a little bit more influential in terms of having a higher share, I suppose, of the open play value that he would get within the team. So you can see that Saka is actually a very pivotal part of this Arsenal team. And now that, of course, he's back in terms of goal scoring and assists, I think a lot of people are now reluctant to, for example, consider him as a sell, but I don't think he really ever was. As far as the forward position, we have a new change in terms of Adebayo. Part of this too is also thinking about in the future, how close are we to getting double game weeks for this Luton team? Yes, of course, I think Adebayo has played extremely well. As you can see, of course, expected goal involvement is incredibly high. So the fact that he's getting consistent 90 minutes now and there's no threats really, I would say, of maybe Carlton Morris, for example, other than, let's say, penalties potentially, him playing so well just means that you have access to a player who could be ridiculous for someone who's trying to build a little bit more of a premium dense team. So if you have players like Salah, Trent, or Haaland, these sorts of players, you would like to have someone like Adebayo who consistently plays, even has chances to sort of fill in key gaps within certain game weeks, like let's say when he has a game week 25 double game week, if he has it, and other things like, for example, a Bournemouth double game week that could also be rescheduled. As far as the other changes here within the forward position, not too many changes other than a rise to Højlund. For me, Højlund, of course, you can see the underlying stats are very poor, but I also think that he hasn't played enough football within a sort of consistent Man United team. So even though he's played a lot of minutes, I think part of the key thing for United is you now have a lot of key players coming back into the team. And of course, we could argue that their sort of level of play will actually improve both on the attacking and the defensive end. And Højlund should be someone that actually benefits this. When he actually, for example, had the back injury or sort of was running through a period of serious goal drought, we did see his minutes deteriorate. And I feel like he has sort of reached a sort of status within the team where he's no longer going to be subject to these sort of really early substitutions. On the other hand, of course, I think it's possible. But for me, Højlund sort of moves up towards a tier just because United actually don't have any sort of immaterially, any sort of bad fixtures, to be quite honest. And so ultimately, you're looking at a player who has a really clean run of games, doesn't necessarily have doubles in the future, but also generally has a good clean run despite not being on penalties. And with Nkunku, he also gets added to the cheat sheet. I still think that because he has come back from injury effectively twice this season, that his minutes will continue to be managed. We'll see, of course, how he sort of adapts back to sort of playing Premier League football week to week now. Of course, we expect that Nkunku is a great pick. The issue, I suppose, is that he is not really, in my mind, the penalty taker at all compared to someone like Palmer. So the question, I suppose, is whether you actually want to be investing into a Chelsea player who very likely also has a Game Week 26 blank. And when you look at Chelsea's fixtures, Game Week 25 and Game Week 26 are problem points. So investing into a player who, let's say, technically has 2 out of 4 bad fixtures in the next 4 isn't probably something that I would be looking at. As far as Haaland, as I said, at the sort of title of the episode, you're looking at whether you have to be forced to make that Alvarez to Haaland move, or whether you need to rectify serious issues within your team. For example, if you're struggling to get 3 defenders this week, or if you're struggling to actually get 8 attackers, and you think Alvarez could still play, for example, versus Brentford, which is very possible. I mean, he could still play in a starting lineup that includes Haaland as well, mind you. So in that sort of context, I think you might want to consider moves elsewhere, just because Brentford away isn't an amazing game. I know we've sort of talked down a lot about Flecken this season, and to be fair, I think part of it is justified given the amount of goals that Brentford have conceded compared to their expected goals conceded. The reality, of course, is you still have to see that Haaland is someone where his minutes will be managed. Even if he, for example, starts, I think when you're seeing, for example, KDB getting early substitutions, in the second half, this could very well happen to someone like Haaland who's trying to build back his fitness too. So I don't think we need to have incredible expectations of him versus Brentford. And if you're not forced to make that move, you might actually be better served holding your transfer as well. As far as the defense, not too many changes here other than just sort of respecting the fact that Newcastle have good fixtures now. So you can see that Botman and Trippier, of course, within this sort of schedule here have actually gotten rises within the sort of cheat sheet. My issue, of course, is that Newcastle's fixtures sort of go incredibly swingy. So it's like 3 good fixtures in a row back to getting bad fixtures. And if you have, let's say, the capacity and the luxury to sort of go into Newcastle players, and you have room, for example, to, let's say, treat Botman as a 4th defender, I think he could actually serve you very well. As far as Trippier, of course, that's a serious sort of long-term commitment. So the question, I suppose, is whether you actually think that Trippier is going to provide that sort of value to you, particularly, of course, in a landscape where, unfortunately, and I'll skip, of course, to the premiums to sort of discuss them now, Trent Alexander-Arnold's minutes, in my opinion, are genuinely under threat. We saw that, of course, and we pretty much could confirm that as soon as Connor Bradley had the amazing match that he had in the previous one. But in general, Connor Bradley has been playing very well. This was something that we knew before last game. And ultimately, yes, even though Trent could sort of play dual roles in the sense that he could play in the midfield like he did, for example, when he was sort of playing a few minutes in the FA Cup, or, for example, could just simply take that right back starting spot right off of Connor Bradley. I think the issue now is that when you're thinking maybe if even Liverpool have a double game week 25, or have a good fixture like the Burnley game, is it possible that Trent's not going to be playing 90 minutes consistently? Is it possible that Trent might not even start one of those fixtures in a double game week? And I think that calls into question the sort of value of Trent as a pick, and I think as a Trent owner, I'm generally a bit concerned about whether I'm actually putting too much value within my team towards him, and I think that's why he does deserve to fall, because of that uncertainty. As far as Udogie, I think he deserves to rise, or rather, actually, guess to get, or rather deserves to get reintroduced to the cheat sheet. Part of this, of course, is that we know that this Tottenham team have been a shocking defense all season long, and so it really does make sense that they're as low as they are in terms of, if you were to rank the table for teams with really bad expected goals conceded, where they sort of land. But the nice thing for Udogie, of course, is because Porro has risen so much in price over the course of the season, you're now looking at Udogie as someone who actually has a ridiculous price point at 4.8, right? Someone who's actually incredibly attacking. So when you compare to some of the sort of key defenders here outside of Porro or Estupiñán, for example, on expected goal involvement per 90, he is one of the leading players here. And of course, when you're looking at some of the key players within even the budget territory, it's players like Doughty and even Udogie who actually stick out the most to me. And with Doughty, I think if we actually get confirmed news over double game weeks for this Luton team, he shoots up right to the top for me as a green pick. So this is sort of the state of the game per se. With Zinchenko, I think it's just sort of looking into how key he has been for this Arsenal team so far. We know, of course, that, I mean, anytime he gets an assist, he's probably guaranteed bonus points like in the previous match. But in general, of course, it just shows how involved he is in an open play. And even if he doesn't get assists, we always tend to see that he's performing extremely high on baseline bonus. So that's a huge plus to Zinchenko and his sort of validity as a pick. And I think I have to give him a rise. Walker or White, rather, is someone that I'm actually looking at, who maybe deserves a fall, but I still think that Arsenal defense is so strong that it would be wrong for me to actually rate White as an orange pick. I'm thinking about Walker a lot. I wonder why. But Walker, for me, when we talk about Walker this week, I think the benching, when you look at, for example, the Diaz benching as well and the Walker benching, I think this was a game where maybe Man City just saw this as scheduled rest. And of course, Walker has had some real life conflicts. I continue to own Walker within my team. I probably will be playing Walker versus Brentford. I'm struggling to think that he would actually not play or start versus Brentford. And my position is that I think he will start the future games. I suppose the question, of course, will come again, which is when, for example, Man City go tough into these Champions League fixtures and they actually start to have back-to-backs, whether Walker's minutes will be impacted. Because, of course, it's not like he's the youngest player on the team, even though he's clocked a lot of 90-minute games this season. So the question will be asked as to whether he'll be sort of protected over this sort of busy end of the season. I personally think that Walker will still be a very, very good pick, so I would still go for Walker if you're looking for, a third City player in Double Gaming 25. But that's my position on the matter. As far as other changes, we have Dunk and Shaw. Dunk falling, of course, and Estupiñán falling too. Part of this is because this Brighton team is a bit concerning. We do still see that they're sort of dropping in terms of expected goals conceded, but also I think when you're thinking about the overall strength of the team, top to bottom, missing out on key attacking players usually also has a small sort of attribution to how weak you are on defense, because it usually probably means you might have less control of the games, and so on and so forth. I just think some of the results so far are a bit concerning, but the biggest thing, of course, that's most concerning is Estupiñán's minutes, right? We've seen his minutes get managed, and potentially it's also injury related, but also 45-minute substitution versus Luton is something that we've seen before, for example, versus Aston Villa. And it's not something that you want to see when you're an Estupiñán owner at all. So with Dunk as well, I think given that also two great fixtures have come and gone, and Brighton have sort of delivered on that promise, I suppose, with getting one clean sheet versus Wolves, but also conceding around 1.2 XG C on that game. Overall, I don't think you can be too happy with the Brighton players if you continue to own them. So I think I would have to drop them, compared to some of the players in this price point, which are Arsenal players or extremely attacking players like Porro. As far as Shaw, I think he simply gets or deserves rather inclusion to the cheat sheet. You're looking at a player, of course, who is on set pieces for United, who is very good in open play, and of course just has really secure minutes, whether he plays left center back or left back for the team. So personally, I think I wouldn't really talk about Shaw as someone that I would think about as a transfer in, but ultimately he's a player that I think it can be a differential later down the line, or if you actually are even looking for a differential now, could be someone that you can jump onto, just because United don't actually have sort of prospective blanks, but instead, of course, just simply have good fixtures that are consistent at least. As far as goalkeepers, no changes really other than Dubravka getting a rise. Once again, you're sort of looking at a beautiful sort of swing between Newcastle's run here. So it's a great opportunity to just look at Dubravka as a pick to go into, and that's pretty much it. I think Dubravka is probably going to be the best keeper to start this week, maybe with exception to maybe someone who has Petrovic, for example. But I think, you're still looking at someone who hasn't been replaced. Pope is still out injured, and you still have access to Newcastle defense at an outrageous price. So that's going to be the cheat sheet for this week for GameWeek 23. The next video will be the team selection. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Goodbye.